Portchester Castle. English heritage described this place as the finest set of Roman walls north of the Alps.
It's basically intact and it's the UK's biggest survivor.
And we know with absolute certainty how Portchester Castle survived the last millennia.
Look at it, it's basically intact.
That's right, Paul. It's more akin to what we see with a Victorian terraced house that's had a bathroom added and a Norman conservatory.
But how did it survive that post-Roman era when so many others at the time were completely robbed out?
And that's basically what we're here today to have a look at. And Paul is joining me. Hopefully he'll sprinkle some of that magic white wick dust onto our waning viewing figures. Nowadays, Portchester Castle is in the care of English Heritage, and we know about the problems with them and the extremes that they will go to stop people from filming. So today we're going to be stealthy. We're going to be a little bit like the DJ Audits of YouTube antiquarians. Have you got as many subscribers as DJ Audits, Paul?
Not yet. One single act probably secured the survival of this fort for the last 1,000 years. It was gifted to Edward the Elder in 904.
And that led in turn to a Norman keep being added, and it even, as a royal castle, became the embarkation point for the Battle of Agincourt.
And then in the 18th century, it was used as a prison.
Leading to the 1800s up to the current day, it's been a thriving tourist destination. But what we want to know is, how did it survive the Dark Ages?
The early medieval.
Hold your horses. Before we answer that, we need the audience retention here. A quick YouTube-friendly resume of Portchester's Roman history. Whilst there have been first century finds, the Roman fort that has survived largely intact to the current day was built around 285 to 290 AD. Favoured as portusadurni, it was built as one of the Saxon shore forts. Roman Britain was having problems with pirates in little boats. It may have been founded by this chap, whose name I won't attempt to say, before he went on to declare himself as rebel emperor of Britain and Gaul. Naturally, this act resulted in him being topped. The fort did go out of use in the early 4th century, but was recommissioned around 340 AD. We believe that it was later replaced by a fort that's now buried somewhere under urban sprawl. However, and crucially for our investigation, it is now believed that civilian life carried on here through the late 4th and into the early 5th century, as evidenced by burials. So there were people living here in 410 AD.
So this is one of 14 surviving Roman bastions. Absolutely spectacular. Now, the reason why we don't have 20, the original number, is because the majority were taken by the construction of the Norman keep over there in the northwest corner.
The entire defensive wall survives here, which is very unusual. The walls themselves are 10 feet thick and 20 feet high. Don't know why I've gone all old money there for some reason. Battlements are largely Norman additions, and the inner wall surfaces were cut back during the medieval period. But essentially, it's intact with later additions and tacky extensions.
So we do have a few bits that have been patched, repaired like this, probably during the medieval period, but the vast majority remains from the original Roman construction. Basically, it's like the medieval equivalent of the Duckworth stone cladding in Coronation Street years ago.
No doubt an estate agent would describe it as retaining many original features with all modern conveniences. Now note, no internal Roman stone buildings survive, and that's because it seems that there weren't any. It was just timber barrack blocks within the walls. Remember that for later. Okay, so I still say the Dark Ages. It doesn't really matter, does it? Everyone else says early medieval, but we know what we're talking about. So we've already seen that at the end of the Roman period, civilian life was carrying on within this fort. We do have to be careful not to treat this 410 date as a drop-dead date. Life in Roman Britain had been changing on the run-up to that for a significant period of time. But there were civilians here. And really interestingly, archaeology has identified that people were living here later in the crucial 5th century, that period where with so many of these forts they were abandoned. They found the evidence for 4 sunken floored huts, a well, and fascinatingly ploughing. They were actually using this extensive land within the walls to grow things. Moving on, there's a whole range of buildings that have been identified through the 600s, the 700s, the 800s. We don't know who it was that was living here, whether it was a warlord or just ordinary people coping with Dark Ages life. It does appear that when we get to the late 800s, it had become a bit run down, possibly a bit of a tipping ground. But we know already that it was saved in 904 when it was gifted to His Royal Highness the Elder. After that, we know it became a burh, and there was a huge great timber structure in here, presumably for someone really important. Interesting to consider what happened at other Roman forts after the Roman army was withdrawn from Britain. If we look at Birdoswald, for instance, on the western side of Hadrian's Wall, there we have that intoxicating story of possibly members of the Roman army setting themselves up as local chieftains, and life did indeed continue there. But ultimately, the maintenance of the complicated stone buildings within the fort's walls became too much for them, and they replaced them with simpler timber ones before abandoning the site altogether at some point during the 6th century. I think I'm right in saying there's been one solitary find at Birdoswald from within the Anglo-Saxon period, dated to the 8th century. And then at Piercebridge, you've got that charming thing where the civilian settlement over the centuries has moved itself into the footprint of the fort, but none of the fort structure was considered worth saving, and it has completely disappeared beyond what you can see through archaeology there. And then out on the Kent coast at Richborough, we saw that there was definitely Anglo-Saxon activity within the fort's walls. There was a church. However, the walls themselves clearly were not valued as anything other than a quarrying source for stone. So what made Portchester different in the, let's just call it the sub-Roman period to avoid all the bother? What was different about Portchester that ensured the survival of those magnificent fort walls?
Is this the point when we really step things up again?
I certainly think it needs to be, Paul. Here are our reasons why this building survived the Dark Ages whilst others fell. Paul, it's finally time to go all Phil Spencer or Kirsty Allsop, whichever you prefer.
Location, location, location. I've always wanted to say that. So Portchester sits at the head of this huge natural harbour, really significant resource for the incoming English settlers, a great reason to stay here.
So inside the fort, ignore the Norman keep, ignore the church over there, you've just got this huge open space. And the evidence suggests a continuity of civilian settlement within these walls, crucially in the 400s. The evidence shows us that people carried on living here in this huge open space protected by these walls. And I think if you imagine yourself as a Romano-British person in the 400s, everything that you knew before has gone away, it's easy to understand why and how attractive it would be to stay living here within these walls.
So unlike other Roman buildings and structures that didn't survive past the Dark Ages,
I think that's surely early medieval, Paul.
well, this one was really simple. There's nothing inside. The walls would just look after themselves.
Such a versatile space with ample room to live and to farm, protected by the walls. So ultimately, it was the fact that this remained in use and useful. There was continuity. That is why it survived the Dark Ages,
Early medieval.
where other Roman buildings were robbed away. Well, thanks, Paul, for joining us today. It's been great working with you again. And you've got a video coming up on your channel that's been filmed here?
Yep, I've taken a bit of a Roman Navy failure take in my video, a bit different. Oh, by the way, don't forget the next the next instalment next Friday. All right.
That's Friday, isn't it? Yeah. Cheers, Paul. It's been great. Thanks a lot.
No worries. Yeah, don't forget next Friday. All right.
I won't forget, Paul. See ya.